From the Hall of Music in the National Museum of American History, and on behalf of the members of the Smithsonian's Distinguished Scholar Selection Committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to this ceremony and lecture by Dr. Fernando Santos-Granero, Senior Research Anthropologist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama and winner of the 2021 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award in the Humanities. This honor, originally and rather paraphrastically called the Smithsonian Secretary's Distinguished Research Lecture Award, has been given 22 times since its inception in the year 2000. Nominations are made by Smithsonian peers of those nominated and must be supported by letters from outside academic adjudicators and by full listings of the nominees' scholarly output. The Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award highlights the Smithsonian's commitment to knowledge derived through historical inquiry, the scientific method, rigorous analysis and peer review, and the syntheses that can result from a broad understanding of a particular culture or period. People trust the Smithsonian to care for America's treasures and to pursue and share historical, cultural, and scientific truth. Because of that trust, it's important that we uphold James Smithson's mandate to increase and diffuse knowledge. Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Awards, together with the Secretary's Research Prizes and the Research Tent at the annual staff picnic, offer Smithsonian employees, members of Congress, and the public several opportunities each year to learn about the remarkable work that takes place at the institution. Each of these events showcases Smithsonian scholars and the new and innovative ways they are sharing their knowledge with the world. The criteria for the Distinguished Scholar Award are, unsurprisingly, exceptional and sustained achievement in research, coupled with long-standing commitment to the Smithsonian, and that rare ability to communicate to both a specialist and a lay audience. I'd like to thank my colleagues of the Selection Committee, which is comprised of previous winners of the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award, who were active in this round's review process. They are, from the National Air and Space Museum, David DeVorkin, Michael Neufeld, and Tom Waters; Christine Mullen Kreamer from the National Museum of African Art; Louise Cort from the Freer and Sackler Gallery's National Museum of Asian Art; Nancy Knowlton and Igor Krupnik from the National Museum of Natural History; Ellen Miles from the National Portrait Gallery; and Giovanni Fazio, William Foreman, and Christine Jones of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. To review the nominations, I think my fellow committee members will agree, is both an enlightening and a rather humbling experience. Enlightening in that one learns, at least in a broad sense, of many research projects, some quite long-spanning, which illustrate the breadth and diversity of our collective mission of advancing the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And humbling, because each of the nominees is obviously an important figure in his or her field. We are honored to work beside such distinguished colleagues who, through their endeavors, uphold the Smithsonian's deserved reputation for excellence. Before we hear Dr. Santos-Granero's presentation today, which is entitled El Dorado and the City of Tapirs, Enchanted Cities and Urban Imaginaries in Indigenous Amazonia, Secretary Lonnie Bunch has some observations on the importance of research at the Smithsonian in these perilous times.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks for the hard work of the committee who selected our 2021 Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities, Dr. Fernando Santos-Granero, anthropologist and senior staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. I am always eager for an excuse to celebrate Smithsonian scholarship. Growing up as the son of two educators, my parents ingrained in me the importance of learning from an early age. There was no higher value in my household than the pursuit of knowledge, and especially in the humanities. Even though my father was a scientist, the dinner table was a place ripe for history, music, literature, and philosophy. I developed a passion for history, for historical scholarship early in my life, a passion that has guided my professional and personal life for decades. But it wasn't until much later in my career that I was able to find the words for why history and all the fields of the humanities matter so much. The humanities are among our most profound pursuits as a species. Fundamentally, they help us understand ourselves and one another. They ask us to recognize the ties that bind us together and to value our differences. They inspire us to think critically and creatively and to follow our fundamental humanity. At heart, the humanities affirm the power of knowledge, the power of language, and the power of our ability to grapple with complexity. In an increasingly turbulent and challenging world, the humanities matter more than ever. That's why I'm so thrilled to participate in today's ceremony, to celebrate an individual who proves the difference humanities scholarships can make. Dr. Fernando Santos-Granero has been with the Smithsonian since 1994. In his time at STRI, he has deeply enriched the landscape of Smithsonian scholarship. His work embraces complexity. His work spans the range of historical and present-day subjects, from indigenous Amazonian practices to regional economies to the philosophies of power. His publications include numerous books, articles, and editorial work on social organization, political leadership, shamanism, myth, ritual, and history. Simply put, the Smithsonian is a more intellectually robust institution because of his contributions over nearly 30 years. In a moment, you'll have the opportunity to hear firsthand from him about his scholarship. I know you'll be as awed and as impressed as I am. Now it is my distinct honor to recognize Fernando Santos-Granero as the 2021 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. On behalf of the entire institution, congratulations on this well-deserved honor.
It's a great honor for me to receive this special award. I am very grateful to the team of scholars at the Smithsonian who reviewed the applications associated with this honor, and to those who wrote letters on my behalf. Thanks are also due to Secretary Lonnie Bunch and to my colleagues at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, with whom I have shared the Smithsonian's mission to increase and diffuse knowledge for 26 years. Last but not least, I also wish to thank those who are viewing this lecture for giving me the opportunity of sharing with you some ideas about my latest research. This talk, as the title indicates, is about a seemingly exotic topic, native Amazonian urban imaginaries. In other words, it is about the ways in which Amazonian indigenous people perceive, represent, embrace, or contest cities and urban lifeways. I say seemingly exotic because with more than 30% of Amazonian indigenous people now living in cities and a growing number of native Amazonians still moving to cities, this topic has become increasingly relevant, both socially and politically. My interest in this topic was spurred by an odd story recounted by an old Yanesha man, Yanesha being the indigenous people living along the eastern slopes of the Peruvian Andes, among whom I did my first ethnographic fieldwork in 1977. We were in the middle of an all-night party, drinking maniac beer and chewing coca leaves, when someone mentioned that he had recently shot a tapir but could not find its body. It was then that the old man told his story. He said that he had known a man who had shot a tapir but did not kill it. The man followed the wounded tapir's trail of blood until he reached a big cave. He went in, and after walking a while, he met a young woman. The woman asked him what was he looking for. the man said he was looking for a wounded tapir. The young woman then told him that he was in the abode of the mother or owner of tapirs, and that the wounded tapir was her mother. She led the hunter deeper into the cave until they reached a large hospital where the young woman's mother was being treated of her wounds. There, the hunter saw an old woman lying on a stretcher under bright lights, while doctors removed the lead shot from her body with shiny metal instruments. The story ended with the tapir woman releasing the young hunter after making him promise not to tell anyone what he had seen. The story made no sense to me. By then, anthropologists had not yet realized that native Amazonians had a perspectival view of the world. That is, firstly, that they consider that all living beings, including animals, plants, spirits, and even some objects, were human at the beginning of times. And secondly, that the souls of all living beings have a human shape. As a result of this, all living beings see themselves as human while viewing other beings as either non-human predators or non-human prey. Thus, for examples, as shown in the screen, jaguars see human beings as wild pigs, whereas wild pigs see humans as jaguars. For native Amazonians, then, humanness is a matter of perspective. At the time, I was neither aware that from a native Amazonian point of view, through sharing of food, beverages, or even the same physical space, humans could gradually become consubstantial with a given animal species. In such cases, the person experiences a shift in perspective, seeing those animals as the animals see themselves, that is, as human beings. That is what happened to the hunter who entered the tapir's cave. He temporarily acquired a tapir perspective and saw the wounded tapir as an old woman. At the time, however, I was not particularly struck by this characteristic of native Amazonian worldviews. What really caught my attention was the fact that according to Yanesha people, tapirs had hospitals. I asked the old man, how was this possible? And as he were stating the obvious, he said, because they live in cities. With the passage of time, I came across similar stories of enchanted cities, not only among Yanesha people, but also among their neighbors, most of them Arawak speakers like the Yanesha. The stories told by the Southern Arawak, as I call this group of peoples, indicate that many animals and spirits live in underground, underwater, and celestial cities. Other stories assert that white and Andean people lived originally in underground or underwater cities from which they emerged as the result of the foolish actions of a disobedient boy. These enchanted cities are endowed with the symbols of the industrial and highly urbanized national societies of which native Amazonian peoples form part. They often include elements regarded as being emblematic of city life: streets, high-rises, cars, motorcycles, lampposts, stores, banks, and surely enough, hospitals. They are places characterized by the abundance of consumer goods, money, and complex technologies, but also of bizarre alimentary customs and alien, often contrary, social and political forms of organization. As we shall see, the urban makeup, architecture, and metropolitan practices characteristic of these places as depicted in indigenous urban imaginaries are not, however, mere narrative props, but are rather the means to convey indigenous concerns about the nature of power, otherness, and domination, as well as the need for resistance and defiance. Before going on, however, I would like to elaborate some more on the notion of social imaginary. The term imaginary as a noun rather than as an adjective has been the object of much interest in the past decades, having been applied to a broad range of social phenomena and fields of research. modern national societies, science and technology, environmental studies, queer studies, and of course, urban studies. As is usually the case, despite its widespread use, there seems to be very little agreement as to the meaning of this notion. While some define it as a symbolic matrix within which people imagine and act as world-making collective agents, others understand it as the cognitive and somatic images that people carry within them to make sense of different situations, peoples, and places. Here, I use the term imaginary, not in the sense of an imagination, a mental product lacking factual reality, but as a representation or complex understanding of a particular dimension of existence that functions as a cognitive tool. From this point of view, imaginaries are mental constructs founded on information derived from a variety of sources, empirical observation and other forms of perception, such as dreams, visions, and revelations, but also oral traditions, received wisdom, third-party reports, and even rumors and hearsay. These mental constructs differ, however, from theories and other kinds of intellectual formulations in that they are mostly unstructured and inarticulate. Social imaginaries are much more, however, than simple sets of ideas about a given aspect of lived experience. They constitute a means to apprehend, comprehend, and make sense of complex realities and practices. As such, they play a central role in contexts of interface with novel, unknown, or little-known peoples, places, or social practices. In such contexts, imaginaries become heuristic devices that serve to explore the differences between the imaginers, those who imagine, and the imagined. They are thus concerned with attaching meaning to otherwise ungraspable situations or realities. Moreover, although based on individual perceptions and understandings, imaginaries are always collective representations, shared by a group of people as the result of prolonged social and historical interaction. Based on the above considerations, I define urban imaginaries as the collective representations or mental constructs informed by individual experience and perceptions that refer to cities and urban lifeways and serve as both cognitive tools and blueprints for social action. I suggest that indigenous Amazonian urban imaginaries consist of images and understandings about the urban reality of extraordinary and potentially dangerous others that emerge through a double mirror process. Known in Western art history as mise en abîme, through this game of parallel mirrors, the elements of the urbanity of non-indigenous peoples are attributed to the worlds of other than human beings, whereas the characteristics of the beings that inhabit the urbanized supernatural worlds are attributed to the human others living in cities, who are conceived of as endowed with extraordinary and often nefarious powers. Urban realities and urban imaginaries are thus infinitely reflective. They are not only mutually constitutive, but being historical constructs, they change through time in response to the experience of new forms of urbanity and urban lifeways. The aim of this talk, then, is to analyze the ambivalent nature of native Amazonian urban imaginaries, how they inform and shape forest-city interactions, and what were the historical processes through which they came into existence. I will start by this latter issue, since it is crucial to understand the allure that cities have exerted over the minds of native Amazonians since ancient times. Given that native urban imaginaries generally refer to objects, customs, and amenities characteristic of modern-day urban centers, it is tempting to attribute their origin to the cities that began to crop up throughout Amazonia during the rubber boom era around 1870-1910. Manaus and Belém do Pará in Brazil, Iquitos in Peru, and Ciudad Bolívar in Venezuela are some of the many Amazonian cities that emerged or expanded thanks to the rubber boom. If indigenous urban imaginaries are based on these urban models, they would constitute a modern phenomenon, the direct result of contact with white people. We know, however, that as soon as Europeans arrived in the Americas, they were informed of the existence of a number of opulent cities hidden deep in the forest. Today, the story that has received the most attention is that of El Dorado, popularized through films such as Indiana Jones and the Lost City of Gold, or Disney's The Road to El Dorado. But the early European chronicles are full of similar stories about golden cities, which under different names were reported by different indigenous peoples in different regions of the Americas. One of the earliest stories was that reported by Spanish conquistador Diego de Ordaz in 1532, who informed that the native inhabitants of Guyana had told him that beyond a mountain on the left bank of the Orinoco River existed a great city called Manoa. The city was supposedly the seat and residence of the Inca emperor. Many years later, in 1594, Sir Walter Raleigh would attempt unsuccessfully to find the city of Manoa, which, according to native informants, was located on the shores of a lake named Parime. In 1535, an indigenous man captured in Quito told Captain Sebastián de Belalcázar that he came from a kingdom of riches known as Cundinamarca, far to the north, where a chief covered himself in gold dust during ceremonies. A year later, the survivors of the failed expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez to Florida and northern Mexico informed that they had heard stories from natives about cities with great and limitless riches located across the desert hundreds of miles to the north. The cities came to be known as Cibola, or the Seven Cities of Gold. In 1538, while on the Bogotá savannah, the conquistador Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada received reports from captured natives about a kingdom called Metza, whose inhabitants lived in a large city with stone houses, temples, and large quantities of gold and jewels. Similar reports continued to crop up during the 17th century. In 1600, for instance, the Jesuit missionary Andrés López informed the Pope of a large city called Paititi, which was located east of Cusco, the Inca capital, and was rich in gold, silver, and jewels. Manoa, Cibola, Cundinamarca, Metza, Paititi, or El Dorado, the common denominator of these legendary places is that native Amazonians represented them as large and rich cities governed by a powerful lord. Given that these accounts were gathered only a few years after the arrival of Europeans to the Americas, it is clear that these early urban imaginaries were not modeled after the colonial cities founded by the European invaders. The stories may have been embellished by the conquistadors to obtain prerogatives from the Spanish crown, but they undoubtedly have an indigenous origin and thus constitute the earliest known native Amazonian urban imaginaries. But if these early urban imaginaries were not modeled after European colonial cities, which was their origin? The obvious answer would be that they were modeled after the cities built by the Maya, Aztec, and Inca peoples. This would be confirmed by the fact that most of the earliest accounts came from the periphery of these great civilizations, northern and southern Mexico, and eastern Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. The fact that these accounts place emphasis on the existence of stone buildings, abundance of gold, and a powerful ruler reaffirmed the connection with the state societies that emerged along the Andes and Central America. This does not explain, however, why similar stories were gathered throughout the entire Amazon basin in areas far away from these great cultural centers. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that these early urban imaginaries may have also been inspired by older urban developments in both the Andes and Amazonia. In the Amazon, archaeologists have determined that around 1300 Christian era, a series of very large settlements began to coalesce in the Upper Xingu region of Brazil. These proto-cities, structured around a central plaza, surrounded by palisades and defensive ditches, and with a series of raised roads connecting them with other similar or satellite settlements, were inhabited by thousands of people. More recent research has demonstrated that it is possible that early urbanism in Amazonia is even older, going as far back as 800 before the Christian era. In that case, the model for native Amazonian urban imaginaries would have been not only the Upper Xingu galactic polities, but also the Marajoan mounds on the mouth of the Amazon River, the Mojos mounds and earthworks of eastern Bolivia, the raised fields of coastal Guyana, or the geometric raised structures found in the Acre region of Brazil. These proto-cities, or urbanized areas, constituted a new architectural and residential development that must have impressed the minds of those non-urban dwellers who saw them or heard about them through the long-distance commercial networks that connected all of Amazonia. There is also archaeological evidence that the native Amazonian peoples living along the eastern slopes of the Andes had continuous relations with the pre-Inca urban societies of the neighboring highlands. In the Peruvian Andes, these were mainly the peoples living in the many citadels that sprang along the Jauja Huancayo valleys of central Peru between 100 before Christian era and 600 Christian era, and in Huari, the capital of a vast empire or coalition that lasted between 650 and 1100 Christian era. The Jauja Huancayo citadels were located on Andean valleys no more than 90 miles from the Amazon lowlands. They contained hundreds of mostly circular, but sometimes rectangular, 1- and 2-story stone buildings, often surrounded by defensive walls. Huari, in turn, was a large city spread over 4 square miles and surrounded by a massive 30 feet high wall. It was scarcely 100 miles away from the Amazon. At its pinnacle, it had a population of between 30 to 70,000 people. Built with uncut stones, the city combined administrative and ceremonial sectors with plazas, closed patios, merchant and artisan quarters, and elite residential areas. Huari's ceremonial sector, encompassing 2 large temples, one of them painted red, occupied an important part of the city and was the focus of most ritual activity. Some buildings were 2 or 3 stories high. Plastered with mud and painted white, they must have reverberated from far away under the highland sun as visitors approached the city. How do we know that these Amazonian and Andean cities were the models upon which native Amazonians shaped their urban imaginaries? We have 2 types of evidence, archaeological and documentary. In the Upper Xingu circular settlements and in the Acre raised mounds, archaeologists have found rests of pottery in ritual contexts that are very different from those of the local tradition, suggesting intermittent visits for ritual purposes by foreign people. Archaeological remains of coca leaves, tropical bird feathers, and tropical hardwoods found in the Jauja Huancayo citadels and in the Huari capital suggest that their Andean inhabitants traded their wares for tropical products with their native Amazonian neighbors. This evidence, plus the fact that these Andean cities were located quite close to the Amazon region, suggests that Andean people visited the tropics regularly, but also that native Amazonians must have visited these highland settlements at least from time to time. Archaeological findings only provide indirect evidence of native Amazonian visits to Andean cities. Fortunately, there is also documentary evidence indicating that native Amazonians visited Andean cities in pre-Columbian times, and that they continued to do so in colonial times. In relation to the Southern Arawak, we know through oral tradition gathered by the Spanish chroniclers that at least some of them had established a relation of vassalage friendship with the Inca Empire around 1470, in times of Inca Tupac Yupanqui. The relationship entailed annual visits by Southern Arawak delegations to Cusco, the Inca capital, during which the Inca presented his vassals with gifts of metal tools and ornaments, while the Amazonian visitors gave in exchange parrots, monkeys, honey, wax, and large quantities of gold. The Southern Arawak ambassadors must have been much impressed with the Inca capital. In previous years, Inca Pachacutic had redesigned and rebuilt Cusco to convey the empire's power and wealth. He had desiccated swamps, canalized springs, and built new fountains to increase the city's plan and improve water access. He had also raised large areas of the old city in order to trace wider streets and construct larger and richer stone temples and palaces. With a population of at least 20,000 and its many streets, buildings, plazas, and markets, the image of Cusco must have been hard to forget. However, although represented by the Inca as reciprocal, the relationship with the Southern Arawak was asymmetrical, insofar as it entailed the use of Inca force whenever the Amazonian vassal friends did not comply with Inca demands. Southern Arawak visit to Andean cities continued throughout colonial times. In 1637, for instance, a group of Spanish adventurers entered the Andean Piedmont east of the highland town of Tarma with the intention of finding the fantastically rich city of Paititi, of which they had heard so much. After exploring Yanesha and Ashaninka territories, the expeditionaries returned to Lima, bringing with them 6 Southern Arawak paramount chiefs. The city's elite gave the indigenous visitors a warm welcome. The archbishop entertained them in his magnificent palace, and the court's highest-ranking nobles vied for the visitors' attentions and showered them with gifts. At the time, Lima had a population of around 26,000 inhabitants and was one of the largest cities in the Americas. Its churches, palaces, plazas, and fountains must have caused a deep impression among the visiting Amazonian chiefs. A century later, in 1746, Spanish General Lamas captured 16 Yanesha men, women, and children accused of being followers of Juan Santos Atahualpa, a highland mestizo who 4 years earlier had persuaded the Southern Arawak and their neighbors to race against Spanish dominion. General Lamas took the prisoners to Lima to be judged by the Crown Court. The prisoners were found not guilty and returned to their lands. They must have been probably the last Southern Arawaks to see Lima in its full colonial glory, for a few months later, a high magnitude earthquake razed the city to the ground. By then, the city had grown to 60,000 inhabitants, and according to one chronicle, had achieved the greatest degree of perfection of which a New World city was capable of. Similar visits of native Amazonians to Andean colonial cities must have occurred all along the Andean range. In brief, native Amazonian urban imaginaries are not a recent development and may have sprung thousands of years ago through contact with early urbanized peoples living in cities within and without the Amazon region. It is clear then that urban life has long intrigued native Amazonians, who regard cities as the locus of both extraordinary power and unusual danger. I suggest that the powerful allure that both ancient and modern cities have exerted and continue to exert over the imagination of native Amazonian peoples has transformed these places into models for the representation of extreme otherness under the guise of extraordinary urbanized supernatural worlds. The spatial, architectural, and sociopolitical characteristics attributed to these enchanted cities clearly reflect not only the experience of living in present-day urban centers, but also evoke ancient connections with pre-Columbian and colonial urban centers. Being historical constructs, urban imaginaries have changed through time, mirroring changes in the encounters and experience of different kinds of urban centers and peoples. In general terms, however, nowadays, native Amazonians equate the urbanized supernatural worlds to white and mestizo urban lifestyles and represent enchanted cities as having qualities antithetical to those that define the typical Amazonian village. Taking modern cities as models, enchanted cities are often described as monumental places where space is organized and used in ways radically different from life as experienced in indigenous villages. They contain lavishly decorated buildings constructed of non-perishable materials and wide open spaces where people gather in large numbers for social, religious, or commercial purposes. Most importantly, enchanted cities are said to have amenities that make life easier: running water, gas, electricity, and public transportation. For this reason, from an indigenous point of view, enchanted cities are the expression of the knowledge, inventiveness, and wealth of the supernatural beings that inhabit them, who are often equated to white and mestizo people. The underside of this is that, like the white and mestizo world, the urbanized supernatural worlds are depicted as being hierarchical, coercive, and oppressive in nature. It is therefore not surprising that the inhabitants of enchanted cities, an array of spirit beings, including owners of animals and plants, forest and water spirits, and the spirits of the dead, are often said to be ruled by authoritarian masters. The utmost example of this conception is that of the arboreal cities of the Urarina, an indigenous people living in the headwaters of the Amazon River. According to Urarina people, trees are the dwelling places of tree spirits whose dangerousness is determined by the arboreal species to which they belong. These trees, in turn, are ordered hierarchically according to the quantity and toxicity of the bitter substances they secrete. Tree spirits are greatly feared for their vengeful attitude and extreme aggressiveness, which is often unleashed in response to human forest activities, perceived as an invasion or an act of deliberate aggression against them. In such cases, tree spirits follow the human transgressor and capture his or her soul. These entities live in large arboreal cities and are considered owners of the tree in which they live, as well as president of the city over which they preside. According to the accounts of shamans who have visited these places, Urarina arboreal cities are characterized by their sturdy buildings, all built after the same model, their wide streets, which follow a strict orthogonal plan, and their great central plaza, the city's central point, where the tree ruler lives in a great mansion. They are also characterized by their large factories and farms, which produce all the goods and foods necessary for the livelihood of their inhabitants. Arboreal cities are organized hierarchically, both externally in relation to other tree cities and internally. At the top of the internal organization is the owner of the tree. Then come the foremen, in charge of supervising all productive activities. At a lower level are the army soldiers who control the city. And lastly, there are the captive human souls who are forced to work in factories and farms. Together, these different entities make the tree city prosper and grow. Externally, arboreal cities are in a permanent war with each other, the aim of which is not the destruction of the enemy, but to capture their products and labor force. This arboreal system reflects the Urarina experience of the hierarchical, coercive, and competitive white mestizo society of the rubber boom period, when the Urarina were forced to work extracting rubber under a debt peonage system. If there is a clear analogy between the authoritarian institutions that govern human cities and the urbanized supernatural worlds, the same is true of their inhabitants. For native Amazonians, city dwellers often exercise power over all those who pass through or spend time in the urban centers. According to the Southern Arawak, they are greedy people always in search of material gain. They try to impose their domination through lies and deceit, and do not hesitate to send their soldiers, police, and engineers to invade, measure, and colonize indigenous lands. Worse still, non-indigenous urban people seek to deprive indigenous people of their vital force. Although city rulers like the Inca may make great displays of generosity to their allies and friends, they may also turn against them just as easily. This is also the case of Enchanted Cities, in which depersonalized individuals often face an authority against which there is no way to oppose. Power in such cities often takes the form of a monstrous and predatory entity, an authoritarian ruler like the Inca, or a precedent spirit like in the case of Urarina Arboreal Cities. Moreover, such power always had visible effects, namely the imposition of a hierarchical order and the punishment of those who transgress it. Cities are not only regarded as seats of coercive authority, but are also conceived of as important sources of power. Regardless of how the urbanized supernatural worlds are described, a recurring feature in indigenous narratives regarding these places is how humans strive to appropriate their power or that of their inhabitants. Indigenous leaders often gain power through their visits to cities and their encounters with high state authorities, where they acquire new technical skills, access to jobs, or influential positions. Likewise, a long stay in the city allows them to develop better skills in the national language or to complete their formal education, thus acquiring useful abilities that allow them to return to their villages of origin and play important roles in the local education and health sectors. The same logic applies to relations with enchanted cities. Shamans and common people visit these cities either in spirit trips or in dreams in order to secure access to sources of vital force, acquire knowledge, or fabricate socially adept people. As some authors have noted, it could be argued that traveling to white people's cities and experiencing their food, bodies, and worldviews is like a shamanic journey. Among the Baniwa of Venezuela, shamans claim that among the cities found in the celestial and subterranean layers of the cosmos, there are two that are sources of antidotes to the negative powers originating from both witchcraft and colonial cities. Similarly, the Manchineri and Apurina of Brazil often associate shamanic journeys to obtain power from various supernatural agents with their present efforts to understand and control the political institutions and sources of knowledge of contemporary cities. analogous to shamanic initiation, visiting or simply getting to know the urban world of white and mestizo people can provide the necessary experience to master relationships with the other, such as representatives of state institutions and various non-indigenous actors. The acquisition of the power and knowledge of urban others implies, however, a process of personal transformation. It entails becoming the other, even if only partially and temporarily. In the case of Enchanted Cities, it requires adopting the perspective of their animal or spirit inhabitants. That is what shamans do when visiting such cities. In the case of modern cities, it entails adopting the perspective of white and mestizo people. By adopting urban ways of dressing, adorning, and treating the body, or by copying urban ways of building and planning, Amazonian indigenous people seek to adopt the perspective of the more powerful white and mestizo others. By so doing, they hope to be able to better understand them, establish peaceful social relationships with them, and obtain their powers and knowledge. This does not mean, however, that the strong attraction that contemporary cities exert over indigenous peoples lead inevitably to abandoning their indigenous identities and ways of life. It simply means that native Amazonians are willing to experience difference with all the challenges this represents as a survival strategy. In general terms, such a strategy may adopt two forms: indigenizing the city or urbanizing the forest. In effect, when the urban experience seems to foster, even when the urban experience seems to foster homogenization and acculturation, the daily lives of indigenous families residing permanently or temporarily in cities demonstrate their exceptional capacity for adaptation, resignification, negotiation, and cultural reworking. This creative force, which enables the cultural reproduction of native Amazonian societies, is often associated with a conscious effort to domesticate or indigenize urban spaces. By maintaining their own social and cultural practices, indigenous urban dwellers not only promote the creation of more complex and pluricultural urban spaces, but also redefine the social practices and identification processes of local groups. In the process, they produce specific places for different types of coexistence, diversify the urban landscape, and create new territories. Instead of adapting their bodies and practices to the urban space, they turn urban spaces into familiar places. This attitude is evident in many native Amazonian villages in which their inhabitants have tried to incorporate urban elements such as a great street plan, decorated plazas, brick houses, and even street signals. In such cases, the seemingly paradoxical act of urbanizing the forest is a way of capturing the power of white mestizo cities in order to improve their own living conditions. It is also, however, an act of rebellion and defiance, insofar as it entails a refusal to submit to the hierarchies and impositions of city life without losing the possibility of enjoying its advantages. Such attempts at urbanizing the forest continue the subtle process of appropriating and incorporating urban powers with the objective of turning villages into semi-autonomous zones of refuge and well-being. This is, in many cases, an aspiration that translates into changes in the traditional architecture and materials used to construct dwellings, in the construction of infrastructure for common use, or in increased access to services. The aim of the people living in urbanized forest villages is not to look like white mestizo people, but rather to control their sources of power so as to be able to compete with them on an equal footing, Although in some cases, migrants have managed to create indigenous urban communities, life in the city is always difficult, often driving indigenous people to hide their most visible forms of indigeneity to avoid discrimination by their neighbors or potential employers. Even in those cases where there is a long history of interaction with urban centers, and this link is recognized as a condition for access to better living conditions, the city is seen at most as a necessary evil to be endured temporarily in the hope of a better future. The violence, marginality, food scarcity, and pollution that Native Amazonians experience in urban spaces engender feelings of fear, anxiety, and ultimately rejection. Fostering anonymity and disaffection, cities thus represent places of suffering where the indigenous sociopolitical order is inverted and despotic and abusive power prevails. As way of conclusion, we can say that today, Amazonian indigenous people find themselves in a juncture where they are increasingly adopting an urban lifestyle that often clashes with their traditional way of life. Faced with this situation, they have developed a variety of strategies to resolve this dilemma, such as the indigenization of cities or the urbanization of the forest, but also the construction and deployment of rich imaginaries in which countless urbanized worlds coexist. If it is true, as some authors have suggested, that urbanization often begins in people's minds, then it is clear that Native Amazonian urban imaginaries have served not only as cognitive tools to grasp the complex reality of Amazonian cities, but also as a blueprint for social action, insofar as it highlights both the dangers and potential benefits of urban lifeways. In these urban imaginaries, Amazonian indigenous peoples see themselves and their way of life as the ideal form of existence, while the others, whether human or non-human, live an urban existence that is presented as antagonistic to the way of life. Experiencing the city confers, however, value and prestige, insofar as for many indigenous people, urbanity represents an ideal of progress and development worth aspiring to. In this sense, the search for real or symbolic proximity to the city not only feeds the aspirations and expectations of obtaining the benefits associated with modernity, but it often leads to the adoption of an urban style of life. For indigenous Amazonians, moving to the city, idealized as a place of success and prosperity, becomes a means to overcome the limitations of life in their communities of origin and obtain new and valuable resources. At the same time, it poses numerous threats and challenges that Native Amazonians are facing with the same creativity and resilience which they have displayed during the 500 years of contact with white and mestizo people. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for that fascinating account of several important aspects of your work, and thanks to all of our viewers for watching. As we're still in the process of recovering ground lost during the worst days of the pandemic, I'd like to remind Smithsonian staff members that the call for nominations for the 2021 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award in the Sciences is still open, and invite you to consider who among your colleagues you might like to put forth as nominees. Check your email for details. In closing, on behalf of the Smithsonian's broad community of scholars, I'd like to thank Secretary Bunch and all the administrative team members throughout the institution whose work allows research of all kinds to go forward, aiming for a better future for humanity through a more nuanced view of mankind's collective history and a more thorough understanding of the world around us.